Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining me today. Let's dive straight into today's art lesson. So, I want to start out by asking everybody a question. And the question is this: which element of art has the most influence over your brain's ability to recognize what an object is? Why do we know that this is a flower? Is it because of its color? It's because of the value, the texture, the space? Well, the thing that makes it so that we can recognize objects in the world is value. Notice how, like, here in image B, I've switched up the hues, the color, right? But we still know that it's a flower. That is clearly a flower, so 1 obviously isn't going to be the answer. And neither is C. C is not going to be the answer. However, let's say that we have these dark shadows and we switch them for highlights, like over here. And then we take our highlights inside the flower, throw in some shadows somewhere, but then like kind of vary up what we change. And here we have in picture D, this crazy mess. And point of this being, value has a huge influence over how we perceive objects. It's also a hugely important element of art, which we're going to be going over today. This video is designed to go with the 3.1 value worksheet, so feel free to follow along, do that worksheet at the same time that you're watching that video. All the answers for that worksheet are going to be discussed in this video. So, by the end of this lesson, you will be able to understand what value is, learn a variety of techniques to draw values accurately, for drawing realistically, and we'll talk about how you show depth, dimension, and light. So, I like to think of value as how dark or light an area or part of an object appears to be. And value is the result of how much light goes from a light source and is reflected back to us. Additionally, it's going to heavily influence the mood of your art. Usually pictures that are using very limited values, perhaps they don't use very many shadows or something, are going to have a quite different impression from an image that uses the whole entire value scale, like this one here, where we have a very close to pure white here on his left shoulder, and then when we go to underneath his chin, where we have the black of his jersey meets the shadow, the cast shadow made by his chin, we notice that we get close to straight on black. And so we have an interesting image here which uses the entire value scale. And it has an interesting impression. So, now here we have value does all the heavy lifting, but color gets all the credit. Now, why do you think many artists say this? What meaning does this actually have, this idiom that we have here? It's value that helps us to recognize what an object is, and it's that part of color, the value of a color, which also helps to greatly determine the sort of mood that we perceive when we see a work of art. Now, this is also one of the reasons why so many people have kind of sloppy shading. If you yourself are wondering, how can I improve my shading and shade better? Often it's not so much a problem of how you're using a pencil or which pencil should you pick from, but are you seeing the correct value? And if you are seeing the correct value, are you able to match what you're seeing on your piece of paper or your drawing surface? So we're going to now watch a segment about value and how it relates to form with a video produced by one of my favorite YouTubers. His name is Proko. Yeah, let's go ahead and check out his video.
The most common shading mistake I see is not organizing your values correctly. Not making your shadows dark enough is one way, but making your halftones too dark is just as bad. So general sloppiness with your value control is the bigger issue. The first thing that is important to understand is that the value on any particular point on the surface is mostly determined by the angle of the surface in relation to the light source. Unless you're dealing with highly reflective surfaces, then they act more like a mirror to the environment. For now, let's stick to surfaces like skin, which are slightly reflective. I did a lesson on how to shade a drawing a while ago. I highly recommend you watch that next. But generally, the part of the surface that points directly towards the light is called the center light. It will be the brightest spot, excluding any reflected highlights. As the surface turns away from the light source, those planes will get progressively darker. These are known as halftones. The more they face away, the darker they are. After we pass what's called the terminator, the planes don't receive any direct light from the light source, since they are facing away from the light. Everything in there is shadow. Unless you're in space, shadows won't be pure black. Light will bounce off other things in the environment. So within the shadows, you'll have bounce light, or reflected light. But those are still darker than the halftones in the lit side. That's the general concept. There's also occlusion shadows, cast shadows, coarse shadows, and highlights, but you can go over the other lesson for the full explanation. Okay, so now that you understand form and how light reveals form, it's important to stay consistent throughout your drawing. Light reveals the three-dimensional forms because the value of a plane tells the viewer the angle of that plane. If you make your halftones as dark as your shadows, then you're not communicating the correct plane angles, and that breaks the illusion of form. That brings us back to the rule. The lightest dark is darker than the darkest light. Let me rephrase that a little. The lightest shadow is darker than the darkest halftone. Make a little more sense? You'd think that this reflected light under the jaw is lighter than this halftone on the side of the cheek, right? Well, wrong. I'll prove it. Sample this color, extend it out so you can see it's the same color, then do the same with this side. So, if it's in the shadow family, it should be darker than anything in the light family. Organize your values and use them correctly in your drawing. And I don't mean that you have to organize your values exactly like this. You can stretch your light family and shrink the shadows, or you can add more contrast between the two. You don't even have to use the full value scale. You can limit your values so that your darkest dark is a value 5, but the relationship of the values are still organized. And the key is to stay consistent with that throughout your whole drawing. If you break that, it should be intentional. There's also incomplete shadows. Scratchy shading that has all these little holes of light in the shadow. The holes are as light as a highlight, and they break up the shadows and ruin the effect of light on form. So the shadows don't actually look dark, they just look spotty. Shadows look like halftones and halftones look like shadows. The result is dirty looking skin. You can fix this by filling in the holes manually, blending, or preventing it from happening in the first place by shading with tight, close together lines. When the shadows are consistent and clean like this, it has a much more realistic and three-dimensional feeling. The goal is to clearly communicate what is light and what is shadow. That makes clear 3D form.
Alright, so the next thing that I would like to do with you is look at some art together and talk about what's good about it, what's not good about it, with relations to value. This piece that we're looking at right here is really well done. However, it's got some value issues, and if you're doing the worksheet, take a few minutes to pause the video and write 2 to 5 sentences about what you think could be improved with this here work of art with regards to the value. Now, what I want you to think about is first the shadows. How is their use of shadow in this piece? Midtones. How is their use of midtones and highlights? which values does this work lack? Now, you can use this 9-step value scale here, which I've included at the bottom to help you with your answer. All right, go ahead and pause the video and write your answer if you want. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. So let's go ahead and see just some of things that could have been improved with this work of art. All right, so our work of art here on the left, the halftones are really dark, especially the highlights. And we have kind of a flat feeling surface here. Hence, it just doesn't quite have the same dramatic impression or like realistic feeling that image B does. You can see it has an obvious center light here on this left cheekbone. We could also say the center light is up here. And we have a really nice transition into halftones and then to these nice shadows. Let's go ahead and move on now to the next image. Here's our next one. Same thing. Take a few minutes to pause the video if you're in the class to write down 2 to 5 sentences about how the values in this image could be improved. All right, we're going to move on. As you can see, the shadows are way too light. And we're going to compare it to this one, which we also saw earlier in our slideshow. The core shadow here on his stomach and the folds of the shirt aren't nearly as dark as, you know, the shadows that we see here in this area. Now, admittedly, some artists may purposefully decide to use limited values. However, it's my impression that because, you know, we have, you know, this really, really dark area and only like the bottom curve of his jersey here, that this kind of was just like... However, over here we have an obvious center light hitting the top of his forehead here on the left and his shoulder. Then the areas that we expect to be dark, the shadow underneath his chin, the shadow underneath his arm here, and even like this area on his sleeve are then dark. We have a nice distinction of value. Now, here's the last one. Go ahead and take a couple minutes to pause the video, write 2 to 5 sentences about how you think the values in this work of art could be improved, and then I will give you what I think about this work. All right, let's go ahead and move on. So, here we're going to compare this man in the bow tie to this man in the bow tie. This one here has very dark darks, as you can see here in his tuxedo, but then that's put right next to the lightest lights. But then we have some really faint shading here in the face as well. So kind of the bottom third of this painting here is like a different style from the top 2/3. So one thing that could have definitely been improved is making halftones halftones. These though, halftones here, are more like highlights. I would say that if we had more of this color all over his face and then darkened this side of his face, then this would feel a lot better. Over here, as you can see, like we can see that, you know, this left side of his face is darker. There's these shadows here underneath his brow and underneath his cheek right here. But, you know, we also have an area of really intense light here at the center light on his right cheekbone. And for that reason, this image here just feels so much more dynamic and a little bit more proficient. Now, I don't want to give any of you the impression that either one of these artists are bad, but this A piece over here has a couple of places where if we have a good understanding of value, we can see how to improve it to make it a little bit more realistic, if that's your goal. All right, so next thing I want to do is go over a couple of techniques for drawing values that look real. So we're going to talk about how starting from a good reference image makes a huge difference, or, you know, drawing from life, and then using a value scale, and then the distance check. So number one, starting from a good reference image is huge. When picking a reference image, one thing that I like to keep in mind is first resolution. In other words, if you get a picture like this first one here, that's all blown out with low resolution, you're not going to see the colors, the details, and the values really well. It kind of flattens itself out, which is why first thing you need to worry about if you're looking online for an image is like to look up something that is high resolution. Next thing I encourage my students to not do is to use a selfie. They look cheap, and I know that doesn't seem to have any like sort of a relation to value, but the composition of a selfie, especially if the arm is holding it, you have a lot of foreshortening with like a hand or something, an arm. It ends up being not a very pleasing composition. So next, you'll want to be really conscious of the lighting that's used in your reference image, especially if you're combining it with multiple reference images. In this image that we have here, we have this girl, and without me necessarily needing to tell you, it looks like this image could have been used in a lotion commercial or some type of a cosmetic product, right? And in addition to her pose, the lighting here is super overused by the cosmetic industry and just, commercial photography in general because it's pretty, it's pleasant. However, when you have an image like this where there's many light sources, it can look artificial. And if this is something that like you want to have in your art intentionally, then that's totally fine. However, most important is your lighting choices to be intentional and reflect what your artistic goals are, which is one reason why I really like this image over here on the far right. So let's go ahead and move on now to the next tip, which is use a value scale. Here on the left side, we see value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it goes all the way up to 10. Value scales will number it differently, but the important thing is like, can you hold up a value scale, compare it to your reference image or whatever you're drawing from, whether you're drawing from life or a reference image, and then replicate it onto your drawing area. Now, sometimes after a long time drawing or painting, we become sort of desensitized to what our image actually looks like, and we kind of become emotionally vested into it. We can be so caught up in like details and trying to draw things perfectly that we kind of lose the whole image as a cohesive work of art. And so that's why it's important to sometimes stop drawing, stop painting, get up out of your seat and do the distance check. If you take 5 to 10 feet back from your work, then you can often find big issues that need to be fixed. Like for example, if the person walked 5 or 6 feet away from his drawing of Messi here, this soccer one, they would have noticed that this looks really flat, like the background is consuming Messi. Compare that to the high values in this one. Alright, so I want to wrap up today's lesson with this. You gotta know these kinds of rules before you can just break them, otherwise it's just a mistake. Making mistakes and calling it your style, the super old excuse for bad art. It's okay to make, mistakes with this kind of stuff. In fact, you have to make mistakes and then get feedback from people who you really trust, and yeah, that's how we improve. I would strongly advise to not give or listen to poor feedback, especially from peers. And what I consider to be poor feedback are those kind of binary, two-sided judgments. Wow, that looks so good, or like, that's bad. Even in, like, as a compliment, that's good. Really vague terms like this kind of make you wonder, well, what's good about it? I think it's really important to listen to feedback that lets you know where and how you can improve. Like, for example, the shadows on the back of his arm need to be darker. Something that's actually specific and constructive is going to be much more helpful. Well, I had a great time teaching you guys today, and I look forward to our next lesson together. See you next time.